A single perfect smile can effortlessly mask 1,000 acts of staggering incompetence, paralyzing the judgment of the entire room. Welcome to the corporate slaughterhouse. The cognitive miser awakens, craving absolute simplicity over exhausting logic. The evaluator's brain is lazy. It locks onto one radiant trait, instantly projecting a blinding aura of absolute perfection, erasing all visible flaws. Meanwhile, in the suffocating shadows, the actual pillar of this fragile ecosystem is slowly drowning, bleeding out invisible labor. The paradox of human perception is violently absurd. Substance is constantly punished, while a polished hollow shell is actively rewarded. They wear their charisma not as a natural gift, but as a heavily armored and meticulously crafted bulletproof vest, deflecting every single failure. The rigged game begins before a single word is spoken. Visual dominance effortlessly dictates the entirely fabricated final score. The workhorse assumes that relentless dedication will eventually pierce through the deafening noise of corporate theater. But the silence only deepens. The golden child does not merely survive. They actively parasite off the desperate exhaustion of those who genuinely produce value. Minimum effort is flawlessly disguised. Behind a theatrical display of aggressive confidence and perfectly timed eye contact, stealing the spotlight. Willful blindness is a comforting drug. A beautiful lie is vastly easier to digest than a complex, disturbing truth. Every unseen sacrifice builds the fraudulent pedestal, upon which the empty king stands tall and arrogant, completely unbothered by gravity. The halo effect is not a harmless cognitive bias. It is a calculated and highly aggressive psychological weapon of mass manipulation. And the evaluator willingly hands over the crown, completely intoxicated by the blinding glare of superficial perfection, ignoring the foundation cracking below. An attractive illusion always crushes a quiet reality. Observe the architecture of a professional fraud. Charisma is not merely a personality trait, it is an impenetrable tactical shield. When a crisis inevitably breaches the surface, the golden child does not panic. They simply deploy a perfectly rehearsed expression of concern. A slight tilt of the head, a furrowed brow, and the blame magically deflecting away from their spotless, tailored suit. The burden of actual problem-solving is silently offloaded onto the hunched shoulders of the invisible pillar in the room. Watch closely as the workhorse accepts the unassigned weight. They do not protest. They are conditioned to catch what the golden child drops. This is the darkest magic of the halo effect. It allows absolute incompetence to hide behind a veil of perceived charm. Every mistake the golden child makes is immediately rebranded as an unfortunate external circumstance or a valuable learning curve. But when the workhorse stumbles under the unbearable pressure, their failure is harshly judged as a fundamental flaw in their character. The armor of charm is entirely synthetic. It is built from stolen credit and aggressively polished by the validation of the blind evaluator. Notice the spatial dynamics in the office. The golden child physically occupies the spaces of leisure, networking, and high visibility. Meanwhile, the workhorse is practically chained to the cold machinery of production, drowning in the toxic fumes of endless execution. A conversation with the golden child feels uplifting, but look closer at the absolute emptiness lurking behind their perfectly symmetrical eyes. They are a hollow vessel, echoing corporate buzzwords, expertly designed to mimic profound thought without generating a single original idea. The evaluator listens and nods furiously, utterly captivated by the melody of the voice rather than the total absence of meaning. And thus the armor thickens. The bulletproof vest becomes an absolute fortress, effectively locking reality outside the heavy iron gates. The hardest workers do not naturally shine. They quietly burn out in the suffocating darkness, consumed by the very system they uphold. Look closely at the invisible pillar. Their physical exhaustion is not a badge of honor. It is a symptom of severe structural failure. While the golden child effortlessly floats upward, the workhorse is violently dragged down by the inescapable gravity, drowning in unacknowledged responsibilities. The cruelest irony of corporate efficiency is that competence is exclusively rewarded with an endlessly expanding mountain of someone else's unfinished work. They do not complain because they mistakenly believe that raw output will eventually be recognized by the blind evaluator. A fatal miscalculation. But the evaluator only measures what catches the light. The heavy lifting happens exclusively in the deep shadows, completely ignored by the glowing appraisal forms, invisible to the naked eye. The workhorse's desk transforms into a claustrophobic prison, surrounded by towering walls of urgent deadlines and silent panic, shrinking their psychological space. Every ounce of their remaining sanity is systematically drained to power the blinding artificial halo, worn proudly by the parasitic fraud. Notice the terrifying deterioration of their posture. They are physically folding inward, crushing their own lungs just to keep the hollow king perfectly elevated. The human body is not a machine. When cortisol replaces blood, the mind begins to fracture under the unrelenting pressure, screaming in absolute silence. The golden child views this suffering not with pity, but with a cold, calculated sense of supreme entitlement, expecting the sacrifice as a given right. To the parasite, the host is merely a disposable resource. They will drain the invisible pillar dry before casually stepping over the collapsed remains, without a single backward glance. The evaluator actively enables this silent murder. By rewarding the beautiful facade, they implicitly mandate the brutal exploitation of the actual producer, institutionalizing the abuse. The workhorse is trapped in a psychological Skinner box, desperately pressing a broken lever for a microscopic drop of validation that will never arrive. A broken foundation always destroys the palace. A rigged game is played in plain sight, scored exclusively by a culture of willing blindness, celebrating the absolute void. Welcome to the grand theater of performance reviews. This is not a measure of actual competence, but a highly choreographed audition for likability, where facts are entirely irrelevant. The evaluator sits behind a fortress of metrics, wielding a heavily biased pen that dictates the survival of the corporate ecosystem, without looking at the actual data. When the golden child enters the room, the harsh fluorescent lights miraculously soften into a warm, forgiving, and completely artificial glow, masking every single deficiency. Notice the evaluator's terrifyingly docile body language. They instinctively lean forward, desperate to soak in the manufactured charm of the polished fraud, abandoning all critical thinking. The appraisal form asks for problem-solving skills, but the blind evaluator only remembers a confident smile and a perfectly timed joke, instantly granting a flawless score. A single subjective positive emotion rapidly infects the entire rational evaluation process like an aggressive, fast-spreading, and highly virulent psychological virus, corrupting the entire database. The golden child presents absolutely zero tangible evidence. Yet their empty words are immediately etched into stone as undeniable, historic, and monumental achievements by the mesmerized superior. But then, the invisible workhorse steps into the very same room, and the atmosphere instantly freezes into a harsh, unforgiving, and brutally cold interrogation chamber, stripped of all empathy. The evaluator's opaque glasses suddenly become a cruel microscope, obsessively magnifying every microscopic error while completely ignoring the monumental mountains of completed tasks, erasing their immense value. Hard data is weaponized against the actual producer. A missed deadline of 5 minutes completely overshadows a year of unbroken, loyal, and agonizingly painful silent sacrifice, condemning the victim. The workhorse attempts to present their undeniable results, but their exhausted voice is instantly swallowed by the deafening vacuum of extreme prejudice, silencing their desperate defense. Look at the final, heavily manipulated scoreboard. The parasite is crowned a visionary leader, while the bleeding host is officially categorized as a profound disappointment, destined to be replaced. The evaluation room is not designed to uncover the truth. It functions merely as a ceremonial altar to violently validate existing biases, sacrificing merit for comfort. A corrupt scale always favors the illusion. Welcome to the biological root of the bias. The human brain is a desperate energy hoarder, seeking the path of absolute least resistance to avoid critical thinking. Why analyze a complex matrix of actual performance when surrendering to the highly comfortable illusion is infinitely easier? This psychological phenomenon is known as the cognitive miser. The evaluator is not inherently evil, running on extreme mental power-saving mode. They prioritize ease over accuracy. A confident tone of voice or a tailored suit immediately acts as a powerful neurological shortcut, bypassing the analytical cortex entirely. The brain automatically assumes that physical aesthetic perfection equals supreme intellectual and high moral superiority. A deeply flawed evolutionary glitch. Watch how a single drop of superficial charm, instantly diluting an ocean of massive incompetence, turns poison into pure water. The evaluator takes one genuinely positive superficial attribute, copying it across 10 completely unrelated metrics, fabricating a flawless corporate profile. They mistake the golden child's aggressive corporate arrogance, rebranding zero empathy as brilliantly effective leadership, completely rewriting objective reality. How does absolute mediocrity ascend to the highest throne? By weaponizing the exact critical moment when the evaluator completely stops critical thinking and decides to just feel. The halo effect does not require active or conscious malice. It thrives violently in the quiet corners of profound intellectual laziness and administrative fatigue, eating the system alive. Every empty buzzword spoken by the parasitic fraud, feeding a lazy mind craving beautiful lies, replaces the need for a harsh spreadsheet. Meanwhile, the workhorse presents complex and undeniable objective facts, deeply irritating the evaluator's demand for simplicity and provoking severe irrational hostility. The truth is a heavy and exhausting burden to carry. A beautiful lie is completely weightless, landing perfectly onto the final appraisal document, demanding absolutely no intellectual effort. The evaluator becomes a willing hostage to the aesthetic. They actively protect the parasitic fraud to avoid admitting their own profound failure of basic psychological judgment. A lazy mind is the predator's favorite playground. The corporate ecosystem breeds a very specific type of predator, one that feeds exclusively on the silent dedication of the invisible workhorse. Observe the symbiotic parasite in its natural habitat. It does not create value. It merely intercepts the massive flow of productivity before it reaches the top. The golden child possesses an extraordinary radar for competence, constantly scanning the dark corners for vulnerable targets to carry their heavy load. They do not forcibly steal the work in broad daylight. They gently coax it out using fabricated urgency, disguised as a collaborative effort. Notice the terrifying precision of their psychological approach. A quick compliment, rapidly followed by a complex request that drains them of their most valuable time. The workhorse is manipulated into believing they are trusted, when in reality they are being systematically hollowed out for another person's ultimate gain. The parasite positions themselves as the official project face, effortlessly translating the grueling sweat of the unseen pillar into their own brilliant presentation. They weave a masterclass of corporate ambiguity in the boardroom. Every inclusive word, strategically minimizing the actual contributor while maximizing their presence in the evaluator's blind eyes. But when a fatal error is discovered in the final data, the collective blame immediately shatters into a harsh accusation pointed directly at the workhorse. The symbiotic parasite has evolved to completely detach from failure. They build a firewall, expertly engineered to burn the host alive when required, keeping their own suit perfectly clean. How does the victim endure this endless cycle of theft? The parasite feeds them microscopic breadcrumbs of fake validation that keep them running, preventing a total psychological collapse. The evaluator remains willfully ignorant of the grotesque parasitic dynamic, happily admiring the glowing fruit without checking the roots, buried deep in the rotting shadows. This is not mere laziness, it is an act of total consumption. The golden child actively drinks the life force of the dedicated employee and calls it corporate synergy. And when the workhorse is completely drained of all usable energy, the parasite will simply discard the empty hollow shell, without a single drop of remorse. A true parasite never kills the host in public. True manipulation does not rely on brute force. It makes the bleeding victim apologize profusely for the predator's devastating failures. Welcome to the psychological torture chamber known as gaslighting. The golden child must rewrite reality to completely erase their own catastrophic mistakes from the official record. When the invisible pillar finally attempts to set boundaries, the parasite immediately deploys a weaponized tone of profound disappointment, mimicking the voice of a betrayed mentor. They twist the narrative with horrifying agility, transforming a legitimate complaint into a severe sign of the victim's emotional instability, completely invalidating their struggle. Notice the exact phrasing used in the ambush. "I thought we were a team." A brilliant psychological trap designed to instantly trigger immense guilt, paralyzing the target's logic. The workhorse's memory of the actual events is systematically dismantled and violently replaced with a fabricated timeline, constructed entirely by the manipulator. The evaluator, safely isolated from the truth, completely buys into the golden child's false narrative of a highly stressful team dynamic, rewarding the abuser's fake patience. In this twisted psychological landscape, the one doing all the heavy lifting is constantly punished for not being a team player, while the thief wears the captain's badge. The parasite excels at weaponizing empathy. They feign vulnerability, forcing the exhausted workhorse to suddenly comfort the very person stealing their life force. An absolute mind-bending paradox. Over time, the victim's internal compass completely shatters. They no longer trust their own undeniable competence, obsessively checking for fatal errors that do not exist, terrified of their own shadow. The golden child watches this psychological decay, not with empathy, but with the cold, absolute satisfaction of a puppeteer securing the final string, mastering total control. They have successfully outsourced not just their workload, but the emotional weight of their own massive incompetence, directly into the host's fragile mind. The workhorse now carries a crushing double burden: the impossible physical labor and the deeply implanted toxic belief that they are fundamentally inadequate, accelerating the inevitable collapse. A perfectly executed gaslighting operation leaves absolutely zero visible bruises on the terrified victim, ensuring total deniability for the abuser. A stolen reality is the perfect crime. A spine can only carry so much dead weight before it violently and irrevocably snaps completely in half, shattering the foundation. Welcome to the exact moment of absolute psychological collapse. The human body finally initiates a desperate emergency override, forcibly shutting down all higher cognitive functions to survive, paralyzing the victim. The invisible pillar does not go out in a blaze of glory. They simply stop moving as the heavy darkness consumes them, suffocating in silence. Notice the terrifying stillness that follows the prolonged exploitation. The massive mountains of unfinished paperwork instantly become a cold and merciless graveyard of discarded potential, trapping the host. Burnout is not merely a temporary state of physical exhaustion. It is the profound and complete death of professional hope, leaving a hollow shell. The parasite observes this tragic, catastrophic system failure, not with empathy, but with extreme irritation at the sudden inconvenience, demanding more blood. How does the golden child react to the broken machine? They immediately attempt to kick the shattered engine, aggressively demanding a flawless performance from a dead battery, showing zero remorse. But the host has finally bled out completely in the shadows, leaving absolutely nothing but an empty vessel of dried ink, useless to the predator. When the workhorse completely stops generating massive corporate value, the protective artificial halo around the parasite begins to flicker, exposing the fragile core. The blind evaluator suddenly feels a strange shift in the atmosphere. The magical, endless flow of flawless results abruptly dries up completely without any logical warning or explanation, confusing the lazy mind. For the very first time in this parasitic relationship, the predator is forced to actually touch the raw machinery, panicking in the dark. A fake smile cannot process complex logistical data structures, nor can a tailored suit shield against an incoming deadline, triggering an internal alarm. The golden child desperately scrambles to find another vulnerable target, rapidly sweeping the dark room for a fresh supply of energy, terrified of the spotlight. But the catastrophic damage has already been deeply institutionalized, and the entire structural foundation begins to loudly crack and groan under its own weight. The breaking point always exposes the hidden architecture. The corporate theater can sustain an illusion for years, but a genuine crisis always demands a brutally authentic foundation, shattering the painted facade. Observe the exact moment objective reality violently crashes into the carefully constructed and deeply protected bubble of administrative ignorance, exposing the absolute void. A critical system failure demands immediate and complex problem-solving, an arena where superficial charm and a tailored suit are utterly useless, paralyzing the predator. The golden child instinctively deploys their standard defensive arsenal, offering a perfectly rehearsed smile and empty buzzwords to a collapsing structure. But physics does not care. They confidently attempt to delegate the massive catastrophic problem, only to suddenly realize the invisible pillar they previously drained is completely gone, leaving them completely exposed. Panic finally breaches the impenetrable armor of synthetic charisma, rapidly transforming their flawless posture into a pathetic display of pure terror as the spotlight turns lethal. The blind evaluator furiously demands the usual miraculous rescue, aggressively shaking the empty shell of the parasite they falsely crowned, refusing to accept reality. But a red checkmark on a deeply biased appraisal form cannot mathematically stop a massive structural collapse from entirely destroying the company, proving the metrics were always lies. Notice how the golden child immediately attempts to flee, actively searching for a pristine white lifeboat while the lower decks flood, abandoning the loyal crew. They are engineered solely for the brilliant theatrical performance, completely lacking the heavy density required to anchor a ship in a storm, floating away like hollow plastic. The evaluator is left standing entirely alone in the wreckage, clutching a stack of glowing reviews that are now completely worthless, surrounded by undeniable ruin. The cognitive miser is violently forced to finally wake up, paying the ultimate astronomical price for years of lazy and comfortable judgment. Trapped in the disaster, the halo effect has successfully hollowed out the entire ecosystem, leaving a majestic but deeply rotten corporate tree to fall without a sound, crushing the blind gardener. Objective reality is the ultimate and most unforgiving auditor, systematically tearing down every single fraudulent pedestal built by subjective human bias, leaving absolutely nowhere to hide. A beautiful lie cannot stop a falling knife. Systems built entirely on visual illusions will inevitably collapse violently under their own massive shadows, leaving nothing but dust. Look at the hollow crown that remains. The golden child was never a king. They were merely a heavily decorated parasite sitting on a fragile paper throne, waiting to fall. When the final audit of reality arrives, absolute incompetence can no longer hide behind a perfectly symmetrical and meticulously polished smile. The facade is dead. The evaluator is left digging through the wreckage, desperately searching for the brilliant metrics they hallucinated during their deep administrative slumber, finding only empty air. They traded the actual structural integrity of the company for the brief and intoxicating comfort of a highly charismatic and extremely empty conversation. A fatal bargain. And what about the invisible pillar that collapsed? Their silent burnout was not just a personal tragedy, it was a blaring klaxon warning of a deeply infected and completely broken system, completely ignored. The golden child does not stay to rebuild the ruins. They simply pack their polished charm and quietly slither away to find a brand new host, escaping all accountability. They will easily pass another superficial interview, instantly projecting that same blinding aura of perfection to deceive another lazy and exhausted mind, repeating the toxic cycle. The halo effect is a contagious psychological disease. It fundamentally rewards the ultimate imposter while actively punishing the very people who physically keep the heavy iron wheels turning, destroying true merit. A workplace that measures value by the reflection of a smile is actively signing its own catastrophic death warrant in thick and undeniable black ink, sealing its fate. The human brain is a flawed and lazy machine. We must actively fight the urge to instantly assign supreme competence to someone simply because they possess an attractive face, demanding actual proof. Real competence does not need to glow in the dark. It is built in the quiet, measured by undeniable results, and forged in the agonizing fires of unseen dedication, rarely seeking applause. Do not let a beautiful lie blind your judgment. The next time a perfect golden child offers you an effortless solution wrapped in a highly charismatic and confident voice, demand to see their hands. If their hands are perfectly clean and devoid of ink, you are looking directly at a professional parasite actively preparing to bleed you completely dry. Run away immediately. The brightest halos cast the darkest shadows.